Hello, my name's Elaine and I'm from Nest Book Festival. Thank you so much for joining us today for this Book Week Scotland event about the new Biographical Dictionary of Scottish Women. As you know, we had to cancel our in-person book festival this year due to COVID-19, so we're really delighted to be able to come online and into the digital world to make this event happen during the pandemic. We'd like to thank Book Week Scotland for their funding and support in making it possible, and also thank our normal book festival funders and supporters for all the help that they give us throughout the year. We are hoping to be back with you in person in 2021, and we look forward to that. But in the meantime, we're absolutely delighted to be able to have this opportunity to share the new Biographical Dictionary of Scottish Women. This is such a fabulous text, so full of stories and information about the notable women of Scottish history, and we're really delighted to be able to share it with you today. The book was edited by Elizabeth Ewan, Rose Pipes, Jane Rendall and Siân Reynolds. And I'm absolutely delighted to say that we have 3 of those 4 editors joining us today from various parts of the country. I hope many of you are joining us from various geographical locations that perhaps wouldn't be able to join us in person in the Highlands. So welcome all of you. The 3 editors are going to share their experiences and knowledge of the women of Scotland from its past, and then we're going to have some discussion and some questions. So I'm really looking forward to being able to get into a bit more detail about some of the women of Scotland. Some you may be familiar with and some may be unknown to you so far. So the 3 editors that we have with us today are Siân Reynolds, who's an Emeritus Professor at the University of Stirling, Jane Rendall, who is an Honorary Fellow at the University of York, and Rose Pipes, who's a former commissioning editor and now independent researcher based in Edinburgh. So I'm now going to hand over to Siân, who's going to tell us much more about the new Biographical Dictionary of Scottish Women.
Yeah, well, it was a challenge to start editing this Biographical Dictionary of Scottish Women. The challenge was thrown down, if you like, a long time ago by Hugh MacDiarmid, who is one of the founding fathers of Scottish nationalism. And he wrote in 1936, that Scottish women of any historical importance or interest are curiously rare. Well, we set out to challenge that. But it's true that although there have been a lot more books about Scotland in the last 20 years, lots of books about Scottish history, women were still not very present in these books. And a lot of people, if you ask them, would only be able to name a few Scottish women. I mean, most people would think straight away of famous people like Mary Queen of Scots or Flora MacDonald, and then they would sort of start thinking about people who are here today. But we felt that there was more to be done, and the publisher thought that all the same it would be quite a short book, perhaps a few dozen entries. Well, we ended up with the first edition with 800, and there were more in the second edition. And the reason for that is that we thought that the whole landscape of the Scottish past would be completely changed if we knew that there were more women in it and named women. In the index of lots of books about Scotland, you go down the index, lots and lots of male names, very few women's names. And we wanted to make sure that we had named women there whose lives could be really explored. So that was one thing. Of course, we couldn't do this on our own. We had many, many contributors. But the team was, as you suggested, the original team was Elizabeth Ewan, who is in Canada, can't be with us today, and the late Sue Innes, and Rose and myself. And for the second edition, we've had Jane join us. Sue Innes was very important to the beginning of the book. And she was a journalist, and some of you may have heard of her, and a campaigner, but she was particularly good at picking up slogans. And she thought of our epigraph, which is a poem by a Dundee woman, Mary Brooksbank. And it reads, "Politicians and rulers are richly rewarded, but in one woman's life is our history recorded." So we took that as our basis, that we'd be talking about lives. And of course, whenever we mention it to anyone, the first question they want to know is who's in, who's out. And if you were to turn, it's in alphabetical order, and if you were to turn to S, you might say, what? Nicola Sturgeon's not in here. And the reason for that is a very good one. That is to say that Nicola Sturgeon is still very much with us. One of the rules that we had to apply, and it's not negotiable really, was no living people. And the reason for that, in a way, is practical. In a way, it's philosophical, if you like, that living people are still creating their lives, and we want to be able to have the whole story of someone's life, which is only possible after their death. So no living people. And then the next thing people say is, well, who do you mean by Scottish women? And we tried to be generous about Scottish in the sense that a lot of people outside Scotland who would feel that they were Scottish, but we had to apply some criteria. Most of them in the book, in fact, were born, lived and died in Scotland. But we have also women who were born in Scotland but went and lived their lives somewhere else. And we have increasingly women who have come to live in Scotland from the rest of the UK or Ireland and further afield. And of course, in more recent centuries, that group has grown as well. So we have quite a big group like that. But those were the criteria really that we had to base it on. But there were other things as well that we wanted to be sure of, and one was geographical. We wanted to have representatives from all over Scotland, so from the Highlands, the Islands, from all the main cities, but from small towns. And from Inverness in particular, for instance, we have a certain number of women like novelist Jessie Kesson and Josephine Tay, the pioneer of children's education, Margaret Macmillan, professor of brewing. There are not very many women professors of brewing. Anna MacLeod was from Inverness, and she was the professor of brewing here in Edinburgh. And we also wanted a historical range. We wanted it to cover a lot of the past. I think one of the earliest factual woman we have in there is a woman who is married to a tribal leader at the time of the Roman invasion of Scotland. So it goes a long way back, although we have a few mythical names. And then we have sort of, people say, well, are they all famous? The answer to that is no. We do, of course, have a lot of famous women. Mary Queen of Scots is there. For instance, Muriel Spark, a novelist. We have film stars. We have plenty of queens, actors, writers, artists. There are quite a lot of famous people in there. But it isn't the only thing. Fame is a kind of a creature of the media to some extent. So we've got a certain number of women who had achieved a lot in their fields, in law, medicine, politics, increasingly, of course, in the 20th century, but earlier as well. Women who were remarkable for writing or painting. But again, we didn't want it to be just who's who and achievements. We wanted it to be real life stories. So we tried to make every entry a real life story, not just a list of kind of prizes or achievements or something like that. And we could have almost filled it with suffragettes because we found an awful lot of women who campaigned for the vote originally, and then in many women's campaigns. So we've got a representative section like that. But not everybody was a heroine. A lot of women broke the rules, and some of them broke them in a bad way: criminals, murderers, spies, and a lot of women were treated as if they had broken the rules. And that's a category of whom we have a lot of examples: women who were executed for being witches, or being accused of being witches. So there are women who are good, there are women who are bad, there are a great many women who are in between the two. And finally, we had some women who are not famous at all, but whom we could document. We knew about the lives of some women who had been working in occupations that are essential to Scotland's past, and the economy and society of Scotland. So we have examples of a fishwife, a herring gutter, a Shetland knitter, a coal miner, farm workers, a bondager, and a shepherd. We have examples of lives of women who on whom, if you like, Scotland depended, but whose names are not necessarily known. So that's a kind of quick run through of the kind of thing we thought we were doing when we launched this enterprise. And Jane's going to say a few words now about the second edition and how that developed.
Right. Well, the new Biographical Dictionary appeared in November 2018 to coincide with the centenary of the Act granting propertied women over 30 the parliamentary suffrage. And because the first edition had been so successful, Edinburgh University Press were quite happy to issue the second edition, which had 496 pages, as a paperback from its first publication. So, on the changes in the new edition. First of all the entries in the new edition were corrected. None of them were dropped. We asked all the contributors to update their entries, and the editors also checked them all 800. So in some cases, new research meant a great deal of further information was available, and we'll give examples of that later. We also invited some suggestions for women who'd been previously left out. So this time, we included the amazing Dame Maria Matilda Ogilvie-Gordon, unaccountably omitted from the first edition. She was a pioneering female geologist who learnt how to climb in the Dolomites in the 1890s in order to research the paleontology and the geology of the South Tyrol. And she was also an extremely active campaigner for women's rights. Secondly, new entries were made possible by recent research and especially new work on Scotland and the British Empire. Research undertaken at University College London on the compensation received by slave owners in 1834 allowed us to identify Scottish women who owned slaves. We've also been able to identify a few of the formerly enslaved women who were sometimes brought to Scotland by their owners as domestic servants and occasionally as wives. I'll be talking about one of these later. There are more women in the new edition with parents born outside Scotland who came to make their home, wholly or partly, in Scotland. Agnes Uwandi Savage was born in Edinburgh to Nigerian and Scottish parents, and she was probably the first West African woman to qualify as a doctor in the West, in Edinburgh in 1929. She subsequently played a key role in developing medicine in the then Gold Coast, now Ghana, though she suffered greatly from the institutional racism of the Colonial Office, which initially paid her only, quote, native rates and required her to sleep in the servants' quarters. The pioneering artist, Pamela Hung So, grew up in one of the first Chinese families in Glasgow, and her work explores Scottish Chinese heritage and culture. Well, thirdly, the largest number of the new entries came from Scottish women who died since the first entries were commissioned in 2004. So again, we asked for suggestions and we combed the obituaries in the newspapers. The 20th century saw a massive expansion in the possibilities for women in all kinds of ways. In politics, in government, in world wars, in the arts, in sports, and all kinds of alternative activities. Women's lives changed radically. We have many firsts in the new edition. The first policewoman, the first bell ringer, the first powerboat racer, and the first woman to head HMRC. We've included ministers of religion, protesters against nuclear arms, foreign aid workers, film directors, and women who worked in Bletchley Park in the Second World War. There were many possibilities from these generations, and we had to make some really quite hard choices. We hope we found a balance between the obvious names, like the novelist Muriel Spark and the ballet dancer Moira Shearer, and less famous women, whose lives we thought, and we hope you will, were still of great interest. So I'll pass you over to Rose now to talk about what you will find when you open up the new Biographical Dictionary.
Well, thanks, Jane. I don't know how familiar people are with biographical dictionaries, but as the name suggests, they contain biographies of individuals selected according to certain criteria you've just heard about and arranged in alphabetical order. And we expected most readers of the dictionary to dip in and out of it to search or possibly search for specific names or categories of women. But what we really didn't expect that was anyone would start at A and read right through to Z, which is, a lot of pages. Surprisingly, though, one or two people did do that, and they told us just how rewarding it was as a way of gaining a vivid and enthralling insight into the lives and achievements of Scottish women stretching across more than a millennium. We knew the book would be of value as a work of reference, particularly for scholars and researchers. But as Siân has said, we also wanted to be a lively read and to include as many women as we could fit into the number of pages we'd been allocated. So we decided to keep the entries quite short, averaging about 250 to 300 words, and to include lists of sources and suggestions for further reading so that readers could find out more about the subject if they wanted to. So for each entry, we adopted a basic format, which included the subject's first and surnames with their maiden as well as married names and any pseudonyms they used. Titles and honours were included, and dates and places of birth and death, and the names and occupations of both parents, and where relevant, of husbands. All information that we knew would be of interest to anyone doing ancestral research, particularly. The initials of the author of an entry are given at the end of it, and these are referenced in full in a list of contributors, which, as well as their full names, also includes their place of work or residence, and I'll come back to that later. For many biographical dictionaries, the entries are written by a handful of competent writers, and that's what our publisher expected would be the case with our dictionary. So they were rather taken aback when instead we commissioned over 200 authors to write the 800 plus entries, and most of whom, they were academics who'd done extensive research into the subjects. And although many and most of them, in fact, lived and worked in Scotland or the rest of the UK, quite a few came from other countries, Australia, Canada, and France, for example. So it was a big international spread of writers. And for readers keen to identify women belonging to a particular category, such as artists, politicians, or gardeners, we provided a thematic index in which the women were grouped together under category headings with page references to their entries. And given the wide range of women we included, some didn't fit easily under conventional headings, so we had to invent new ones, such as transgressors, muses, society figures. Some examples of which we'll be telling you about next. So I'll hand back now to Siân to speak about the women she's chosen.
I think you're handing it back to me, Rendall.
I'm handing it back to you, Jane, sorry.
Yeah, that's fine. So first of all, I'm going to talk about an entry which was substantially revised for the new edition on Christian Fletcher, a 17th century minister's wife who was born around 1619. She was responsible, with other women, for saving the Scottish regalia, the crown jewels known as the Honours of Scotland, from the hands of Oliver Cromwell, who invaded Scotland in 1652. The Earl Marshal of Scotland, who in 1651 was made responsible for the regalia by the Scottish Parliament, hid them for his safety in his castle at Dunnottar, near Stonehaven. When he was captured, he left them in the care of his mother, the formidable Lady Mary Erskine. But Dunnottar Castle was vulnerable to Cromwell's forces. Christian Fletcher was then the wife of the local minister, James Granger, at Kinneth, about 5 miles south of Stonehaven. Between Lady Mary, James Granger, and Christian Fletcher, a plot was hatched for Fletcher to carry the regalia out of the castle in 3 dangerous journeys, taken with only an unnamed servant woman, with first the crown and the sceptre concealed under her clothing, and then a sword and finally the scabbard under bundles of flax carried on her back by the servant. Each item was then buried beneath the flagstones of Kinneth Old Church. After the restoration of Charles II in 1660, the credit for the rescue was hotly disputed, and Christian Fletcher's part went unrecognised. Perhaps that's because we now know, on James Granger's death in 1663, she married a libertine, the rake James Lord Abercrombie, to whom she bore a daughter 5 months after marriage. Her reputation was entirely lost. The part played by Granger and Fletcher was rediscovered only in 1818 by Walter Scott. Granger was finally acknowledged in a 19th century memorial in Kinneff Old Church, but not Christian Fletcher. But a new biography of Fletcher was published in 2009, which gave her the prominence she deserved. Only now has her role been fully acknowledged in interpretative panels recently installed in both the church and the castle, though still under her husband's name rather than her own. But at Edinburgh Castle, a reconstruction of the burial of the regalia now makes Fletcher's role quite clear. I'm turning now to a quite different woman, an enslaved woman owned by Scots, who came to Scotland and died in Edinburgh. We know little about such women, but we can trace something of the life of one of them, Malvina Wells, born into slavery around 1804 in the small island of Carriacou, just north of Grenada. She was the daughter of an unnamed enslaved woman and John Wells, a small planter. And she appears as Malvina, supposed age 13, on a list of slaves on the Grand Bay estate, Carriacou, in 1817. That estate was managed by a George Maclean with his brother John Maclean, both men from Rossshire. We don't know when Malvina Wells came to Scotland, but in the 1851 census, she's recorded as a lady's maid to Joanna Macrae, the daughter of John Maclean, at 33 Great King Street, Edinburgh. Then she appears again in later censuses as living in various Edinburgh streets with different families, until in 1881 she's back with Joanna Macrae, now widowed, at 14 Gloucester Place. She died in Edinburgh in 1887, aged 82, and she's buried in the Macrae family plot in St John's Cemetery in Princes Street. She's described on her tombstone there as, for upwards of 70 years, a faithful servant and friend in the family of Mrs. Macrae, Edinburgh. But there's another side to this story. A number of Scottish women benefited from the compensation paid to slave owners, though not to slaves, after the abolition of slavery in 1834. One, Cecilia Douglas, daughter of a West India merchant, in 1794 married Gilbert Douglas, a rich absentee West India planter in Glasgow. On his death in 1807, she inherited a half share of his population and half the enslaved people that he owned in St Vincent and Demerara. In the 1820s, she toured Europe, acquiring luxurious objects and paintings. On the abolition of slavery in 1834, she received over £3,000 from the British government in compensation for her slaves. And she died a very wealthy woman. When she died in 1862, she left her entire art collection to Glasgow Corporation, and it's now in the Kelvingrove Art Gallery. Well, many of our entries, as I said earlier, were prompted by working through obituaries. It's from her obituary in The Scotsman that we found the last survivor from the 36 inhabitants who were evacuated from the island of St Kilda in 1930. Rachel Johnston, born Rachel Gillies, who died in 2016, was 7 when she left the island. That discovery prompted us to include a new entry for Williamina Barclay, the nurse who played a significant role in the evacuation. Barclay was born in Glasgow in 1883. A fully trained nurse, she accepted a post on St Kilda in March 1928. Though she was very shocked by the poverty of the islanders, she still managed to build a relationship with them and came to understand their economy. In June 1929, she reported to health officials in Edinburgh that there weren't enough able-bodied men on the island to carry out normal seasonal work, including grazing their sheep, their only source of monetary income, on the neighbouring island of Borreray. The civil servants noted the opinions Nurse Barclay has formed were based on sympathy and sound judgment. Over the winter of 1929, after a poor summer crop, the communications between St Kilda and the mainland failed for over 2 months, leaving islanders without help and short of food. One island woman died of acute appendicitis, and no help from the mainland came till April. When interviewed in 1975, Berkeley remembered that in April 1930, she gave over 30 St Kildans a hearty tea and suggested to them that they think about evacuation and draw up a petition. That petition, signed by all the islanders, survives in the National Records of Scotland today. The Scottish Office agreed. In June 1930, Berkeley was asked to act as a government representative on the island to make the necessary arrangements. And on 29th of August 1930, she sailed with the St Kildans to Loch Arlin, a small village in Argyll, where most of them settled. She visited and she reported on them all, including the young 7-year-old Rachel Johnson after the move. Williamina Berkeley died in Paisley in 1975. So, I'll now pass you over to Siân. I'll pass you over to Rose. Sorry, back to Rose.
Okay. Yes, the women I've chosen to speak about are from very different backgrounds, and they made very different contributions to Scottish life. The first one is Margaret, or Maggie Keswick, who was born into a wealthy family in the 1940s. And her name was given to what is now a network of 20 cancer care centres attached to hospitals in all parts of the UK, the first of which was opened in Edinburgh in 1996. And these are known as Maggie centres, one of which I expect some of you know is called Maggie's Highland, attached to Raigmore Hospital in Inverness. And anyway, Maggie Keswick was born in 1941, and she was the only child of an English mother and a Scottish father from Dumfriesshire. Her father, Sir John Keswick, was a director of the Jardine Matheson business empire. So she came from a very wealthy background and spent her early years in China and Hong Kong because her father was based there. She then moved to England and read English at Oxford, then went on to study architecture at the Architecture Association in London, where she met Charles Jenks, a postmodern architect and writer whom she married in 1978. I think he, in fact, died earlier this year. Maggie was very interested in gardens, and in 1978 she published The Chinese Garden, History, Art and Architecture, which is still regarded as the standard work on the subject. And it was this interest in her in Chinese gardens and her fascination with meaning and function in landscape, which I think probably led to the decision by both of them to develop a huge and extraordinary garden at their family home in Portrack, which is near Dumfries. It's now known as the Garden of Cosmic Speculation, and it's open to the public at certain times, I think. But Maggie Keswick's life changed dramatically after she was diagnosed first with breast cancer, which she survived, then 5 years later with inoperable cancer. And she published an account of what was obviously a very harrowing experience in a book called A View from the Front Line, which vividly describes the almost callous treatment she had from the consultant she saw when first diagnosed in hospital. And it was this treatment and the problems she encountered in getting appropriate care within the NHS that prompted Maggie and Charles to think about ways of providing a more caring and patient-oriented environment for cancer sufferers. And what they came up with was this idea of Maggie centres to be built close to NHS hospitals. And they were determined that these centres should be architecturally outstanding, they should be inspiring spaces, and so on. And to achieve that end, they invited friends of theirs who were architects to come up with ideas. And of the architects they chose, all were well known, and some of them, in fact, world famous, like Frank Gehry, for instance, who designed the famous gallery in Bilbao in Spain. And what was, I think, wonderful was that they didn't charge for their services at that stage. And the buildings they designed, such as Maggie's Highland, are modest in size, but highly innovative and original in design, and all of them light-filled, peaceful, beautiful spaces. My next subject is a very different character, Barbara Johnston Flucker, a fishwife born in 1784 in Newhaven near Edinburgh, which at that time was a flourishing, close-knit fishing village beside the Firth of Forth. She was typical of the hundreds of women who belonged to fishing communities and whose work was crucial to the success of the fishing industry. And Barbara married George Flucker, a fisherman, when she was 22, and she had 8 children, of whom 3 died in childhood and 1, a son, drowned at sea. She had her own income from selling fish around the houses in Edinburgh and surroundings, and she also ran the household when her husband was away at sea. It was a tough life, but she lived to be 85 and she died in 1869. We probably wouldn't have known anything about her if it hadn't been for the fact that 2 famous Edinburgh artists and photographers, David Hill and Robert Adamson, took several photographs of her wearing the traditional costume of her trade. You may have seen some of these. They're somewhat sanitized because there's not a flicker of fish on them, but they certainly look very grand in their uniforms. Now I'm going to move to my last subject, Kay Matheson, who probably very few people will have heard of. But in fact, she did something rather remarkable. She was born in Wester Ross in 1928. And she became famous for taking part in the daring exploit to retrieve the stone of Scone from Westminster Abbey on Christmas Day in 1950. The stone, which had for centuries been used as, at the coronations of Scottish monarchs, had been taken from Scone Abbey in Scotland by Edward I in 1296 and moved to Westminster Abbey, where it carried on being used for coronations or at coronations. And there it stayed until 1950, when a group of 4 young Scots decided it was time to return it to its rightful place in Scotland. And one of the 4 was Kay Matheson, a trained teacher at that stage and committed nationalist, who took very little persuading to join with 3 male Glasgow University students to take part in the raid as driver and decoy. And the 3 men managed to get the stone out of the abbey, but it fell and broke into 2 halves. And when the group saw policemen approaching, Kay and one of the men quickly posed as young lovers, keeping him in conversation while the others dragged away a portion of the stone. It was finally and successfully returned to Scotland in the boot of their car, repaired and taken to the ruined Arbroath Abbey, where it was later found draped in the Scottish flag. I'm not quite sure what happened to it in between, but that's where it was found. And the English police did actually track down Kay and her colleagues, and the stone was taken back to London. And not until 1996, when the British Prime Minister John Major decided it should be returned to Scotland, did it indeed come back, rather unceremoniously carried on the back of a Land Rover, I think. And it's now housed in Edinburgh Castle. And I think it's rather nice that when she looked back on this exploit, Kay Matheson said, "Our recovery, not our theft of the stone, informed our whole lives."
Well, as you can tell from the previous women's names that have been picked out of this huge total, a lot of these women made a difference. So I think one of the sort of basic criteria is that it made a difference on some level somewhere in Scotland. Well, the 3 I've picked are all from the 20th century. I picked a writer, an aid worker, and a group of women. The writer, and there are many writers in the book, came from Inverness, and she was always known there as Elizabeth Mackintosh. She was born in 1896, just about the time that Malvina Wells died, in fact. And she was the daughter of a local tradesman. She trained, she went to the academy in Inverness, and she trained as a physiotherapist, but came back from England to look after her father after her mother died, and began writing novels. And she wrote about 8 novels under 2 pseudonyms. She was, it seems, quite shy, very shy of publicity, and she wrote under pseudonyms. One of them was Gordon Daviott, because the family used to go on holiday to Daviott. And the second, under which she's perhaps better known, Josephine Tay. And the 2 books that she wrote as Josephine Tay have been named as 2 of the best detective novels of all time. Now, I don't know if people will have heard of them. One of them is called The Daughter of Time, and it's about a police inspector who has a broken leg and decides to investigate a cold case, which is the murder of the princes in the Tower. And he sets out to prove to his own satisfaction that Richard III, who is usually described as their murderer, was not in fact guilty. Well, you have to work out for yourself how successful or not he is. But The Daughter of Time is truth. And the aim of Josephine Tay or Elizabeth Mackintosh, she was very interested in different accounts of the truth. And the second novel is called The Franchise Affair. And it's about a teenage girl who turns up at a police station claiming to have been kidnapped by two local women. The two local women are pulled in for questioning and they deny it in horror. And again, the whole book turns on who is telling the truth, what is truth. And they're riveting books. And she died quite young. And I'm not so sure that she is well known today, but she certainly deserves to be. And these books are certainly still in print. My second choice is somebody who is could only have been doing this in very recent times. She was an aid worker, and she was a young woman from the Highlands and Islands, brought up on the Isle of Lewis, and she's called Linda Norgrove. And her story was cut tragically short. But we wanted to be able to tell it in the dictionary because it's a particular 21st century life of a woman who set out to do things that perhaps would not have been possible before. She was born in 1974 and she read tropical environmental science at Aberdeen. And then she worked in a variety of development jobs in South America and in Africa. And in 2010, she was posted to Afghanistan, where she worked for an American development company, which was particularly concerned to help women develop their own economic independence and, among other things, to move from the cultivation of poppies to other crops. However, Linda Norgrove had not been there very long when she was kidnapped by a group of local insurgents who are linked to the Taliban, and she was held as a hostage. The idea was that she would be exchanged. So it was thought that she was perhaps not at great risk. However, 10 years ago last week, as it were, the 8th of October 2010, the US SEALs launched a rescue attempt, which went badly wrong. And Linda was killed by one of the American grenades that was thrown. The case roused worldwide interest, and her parents have set up a Linda Norgrove Foundation in her memory, which you can find online. And the third sort of choice is a group entry. I thought it would be interesting to point out that we have several group entries, which is a way of getting a whole lot of women into the dictionary who don't have an individual entry, like the Glasgow Girls, for instance, in art, or the Scottish Women's Hospitals group in the First World War, of whom Elsie Ingalls is perhaps the most famous member, but there were many other doctors involved, so we have a group entry. And this one is, Jane mentioned earlier, Bletchley Park. During World War II, Bletchley Park was the sort of secret location of all the code breaking that went on for all the armed forces during the war. And it's often spoken of as if it was an all-male outfit. Alan Turing is very famous for his invention of sort of proto-computers which were used there. But in fact, there were a very large number of women employed there, some of them doing what you might think of as routine jobs, which were absolutely necessary in using the machines that were used to break the codes. Some of them were code breakers, some of them were linguists, some of them were mathematicians. Anyway, we did, as Jane mentioned earlier, for another entry, we combed Scottish newspaper obituaries because a number of these women have died in recent years. They were young women in 1940 to 45, and they had all signed the Official Secrets Act, so that for a very large part of their lives, they never told anybody, not even their closest family, what they had done. But after somebody broke the silence in 1974, they were able to let people know. So we found about 11 Scottish women who had been recruited to Bletchley Park. And one always has surprises when working on this book. I found that our family lawyer in Edinburgh, Ethel Houston, had been as a young woman, she had been one of the Bletchley Park girls. But of course, I didn't know, she never mentioned it. So we have quite a few group entries, which is another way of trying to shoehorn in as many women's names as we possibly can into the book. So those are my 3 picks.
Thank you so much, all of you. That's been absolutely fascinating. And what strikes me is, from the stories you've told, covering such diversity of time and place and influence, and that's just a tiny snapshot of all the figures contained in the books. I find it really fascinating. And as you say, there are women in there that we know well, names we might know well, but don't really understand the full story. And what I find really helpful is that, as you say, that the entries themselves are fairly short and quite tantalising, but you've given enough resource that readers can then be inspired and go away and do further reading about people that interest them. So thank you so much for that. I have to say, one of the things that really struck me is I knew some of the story of Maggie Keswick. The Maggie Centre is a well-known and loved part of our architecture in Inverness at the hospital, and provides a wonderful service and a wonderful place. But I hadn't really understood why they're also architecturally diverse and so innovative, and that's been really fascinating to find out some more detail about that. So thank you for all of that. We just want to go into a few questions, really, just have a bit more discussion. And some of it you've answered already, but Siân, could you tell me why the new Biographical Dictionary of Scottish Women was necessary? Just expand a little bit on that you told us in the introduction.
Well, we felt that, well, you may imagine that we were perhaps a little hesitant about embarking on it again. For one reason, the original dictionary had sold out, so it wasn't available anymore. And the press wondered about reissuing it, or whether they would commission an entirely new one. And as Jane said, there's been a great deal of research in the last 15 years. I mean, it was published in 2005, 2006, and there's been a mass of research done. I should perhaps say that if you like, the central core of contributors, and it remains so, is a group of historians, Women's History Scotland, who have, and that is not just academics, but local historians, people who work in museums and libraries, people who have access to all sorts of documents and archives. And people were coming up with new things all the time and asking us, why isn't X in the book? Why isn't Y? For instance, the question of slavery, this is a very recent research topic which people have been exploring much more in the last 10 years. So there were areas that we felt we hadn't covered. Sports is another one. I mean, it's quite difficult to find a number of outstanding Scottish sportswomen who have lived and died already, because most of the famous sportswomen are still performing, are still working. It's only relatively recently that women's sports have become important, and we see them much more on television just now. And of course, there were a certain number of women of achievement who died in the years since the last dictionary was published, as Jane said. So there are a certain number of motivations, and when the publisher wanted to do it, we were, in fact, although a bit apprehensive, very pleased that they thought it was really going to be a good idea to expand the original dictionary.
Thank you. Yes, it is such a fascinating piece of work, and it's such a great resource for so many people. Rose, could you tell me a bit about who you feel the book is aimed at?
Yeah, well, a very wide readership, in fact. I mean, I think as a reference work, it's obviously invaluable for students and teachers of, Scottish history, gender studies, women's history. And it's also an ideal resource for anyone researching women's contribution to particular fields, such as writers, artists, and so on. And I think it's been a vitally important source of inspiration for all sorts of people, including poets and writers. An outstanding example is a book of poems by Gerda Stevenson called Quines. And all the poems in that, which are absolutely wonderful, are about women in the dictionary. I do commend it. It's a wonderful way of getting a completely different imaginative take on some of the women. And of course, there's, anyone with any interest in the history of Scotland, if they go to the dictionary, will get that history from a very different perspective, i.e. that of women's contributions to history. So I think some people have indeed bought it out of general interest, but I think generally speaking, it's perhaps a slightly more specialist use.
Thank you. Yes, I feel that it's a great resource for anybody. So it's not necessarily, although it has great academic rigour, it's not necessarily an academic book. It's a wonderful jumping off point for anybody who's more interested in the history of Scotland and women's contribution to it. And I like the point about poets and writers, because just to look through that book, there are so many stories and characters who jump off the page, and I know it inspired me to think about what their lives would have been and the contributions they made. So I absolutely agree that as well as an academic resource, it's a wonderful cultural resource for looking at the history of Scotland and the women who've contributed to it in so many ways. Could you just tell me a little bit about Sue Innes and to what extent is this book part of her legacy?
Well, Sue was a journalist, she was an academic, and she was working a lot on women in society today. She'd done a thesis on quite an interesting topic that not many people followed up. What happened to women when they got the vote? Was that it in 1918 and then later in 1928? And she looked at the associations of women, particularly in Scotland. There were citizenship associations where women set up to look at how, if you had the vote, what were you going to do with it? So she was particularly invested in that, but she wrote a column in the Scotsman and I think in the Evening News. And she was particularly, I think she brought a journalist's approach, a journalist's eye, so that was one of the key things that she said right from the very beginning. We don't want who's who entries, we don't want dry dust stuff about just names and dates. We want it to be a life story, and it's got to bring in the woman's parents, maybe her family, her children, her husband, and how she went through life. So I think, we're very conscious of Sue's contribution that was there right through the first edition. And we used to go and sit in, she had a house in Carlton Road from which you could see, I tell you a sort of little anecdote, you could see Holyrood Castle. And we were sitting there one day and the flag went down to half-mast. And we said, oh gosh, a member of the royal family has died. And it turned out to be Princess Margaret, who is in the dictionary because Princess Margaret was born in Glass and counts as a Scottish woman.
Thank you. That's marvellous. As you say, the book contains everybody from royalty to fishwives and everybody in between. And I think it's great value. It's not about the rich and famous, and so much of history that we read is the women of influence and power, directly or indirectly. And what I found really fascinating was to have so many women who influenced the country, but in a very quiet way, as you say, that the workers, the women of Bletchley who went without any credit within their own lifetimes, many of them. So that was fascinating. So many trailblazers in the book. So what impact do you think the trailblazers in the book will have for young women and also for young men reading the book today?
Well, if I answer that one, I would just say, first of all, that as we were all compiling the names to go into this new edition, and as we were reading through these obituaries, we were all incredibly impressed by the lives of the Scottish women that we were reading about from this generation. It was really very striking. And I think there are some really distinguished lives in our dictionary, which I would expect, young girls and young men to read and to feel some awe, really, in relation to those lives. There are women of great courage. For instance, Jane Haining, who many people haven't heard of, was a missionary in Eastern Europe who acted as matron for the Jewish mission girls' home in Budapest. She learnt Hungarian, she was devoted to her charges, and when all the staff were recalled in 1939, she refused to leave. She made the mission into a place of refuge for Jews. When Hungary was occupied in 1944, she was sent to Auschwitz by the Gestapo and died there. Today, she's the only Scot to be honoured in Jerusalem as among the righteous, as one of the righteous amongst the nations. There are others. For instance, Marjorie Farquharson, an outstanding human rights worker for Amnesty, who became really central to Amnesty's campaign against human rights abuses in Russia and the Central Asian states in the 1990s. We have Isabel Newstead, who's, after a spinal injury, became a very early Paralympian athlete in the 1980s, winning 14 Olympic medals across 3 sports. And earlier I mentioned some of the firsts we've got in the dictionary. There are many more that I didn't mention at all. Women who pioneered in fields that are quite new to women and in which, in many cases, they're only represented in fairly small numbers today. For instance, the engineer Dorothy Pullinger designed both car and aeroplane engines and was the first women member of the Institute of Automobile Engineers in 1923. Flora Sadler was the first British woman ever appointed as a senior astronomer in Greenwich at the Royal Observatory. Anne Sutherland, in 1968, became the first British woman to be appointed a consultant plastic surgeon. So there is plenty of evidence of the kinds of barriers that are being broken. As Siân said, we also have the criminals, murderers and spies. We didn't set out to write a book about role models, but the role models are there. And these are good, balanced, well-informed accounts, which can still be truly inspiring.
Absolutely. And of course, it is a very well-informed account and a very reliable account. And that's so important now to have these reliable resources for information. Do you think that there are more challenges in getting reliable information in the digital age when information floods us, but we're not always sure about its provenance?
Well, I mean, for instance, we all use Wikipedia all the time. I use Wikipedia all the time, and it's a great resource. It's very different if you have a book which is a collection of different stories. It's something which has been, Wikipedia is a very good place to start, but it's not always a very good place to finish. Because it's work in progress, and I've often found that things I know a lot about, Wikipedia is not quite so good as the things I don't know anything about, and I'm prepared to trust it. The point about a book like this is we really tried very hard to make it accurate, to make sure that, for example, we had the dates, full dates of birth and death, which you can't always find. They've been checked in the registers. We've had helpers who have been great at checking the registration records to make sure that we really did have the right births and deaths, the day and the month, not just the year, the full names and the professions of the parents. And it's quite important, for instance, to have mothers' maiden names. Again, this is something you don't usually get online because Nobody's really gone to the trouble of looking for it. It's not necessarily what most people want to know in the first instance. But if, for instance, if you're doing research into your family in Scotland, there are lots of ways that you can be helped. But we hoped that this would be a reliable stepping stone if you wanted to follow up something like that. And of course, we, on the whole, the contributors to whom, it's their book. We didn't write all that many articles ourselves. They're written by experts, and they're people who've, spent a long time looking at this particular woman. So they know what they're talking about. And it's, I guess Rose said, I think at the beginning that, some people have kind of read it like all the way through as like a novel full of characters. But there are other ways, there are pathways that if you read one article, you suddenly think that this could lead to another. For instance, there are a lot of gardeners, creators of gardens. And if you're keen on gardens, that's where you would go, which is not something that you will necessarily find online in the same way. You won't be able to sit in an armchair and look through it in comfort with a cup of coffee at your hand and be able to sort of jump from place to place. You don't have to look at a screen, in other words, to get reliable information.
Absolutely. And it feels to me like a book that will be on a shelf and well thumbed over many, many years for many different reasons for a lot of people. And as you say, it's not just a dry list of people. It's a doorway into so many different lives and stories. That's really fascinating. So do you all have a woman in the book who has surprised you that you maybe thought you knew about, but then when receiving the contribution from the authors, felt a level of surprise about?
Well, shall I kick off there? One woman that really did surprise me, because I had no idea that she was behind what is now probably one of the best known products of Scotland, which is Harris tweed. And that was Catherine Murray, Countess of Dunmore. And her connection with the tweed began when she married Alexander Murray, who was the 6th Earl in 1836. And his estates actually included the Isle of Harris. And when he died, Catherine became responsible for them on behalf of her 4-year-old son. And apparently there was a dreadful potato famine between 1846 and 7, which led to a lot of suffering among the tenants on the estate. When, there was tweed being created, but it was Lady Dunmore, or Catherine Murray, who promoted and developed the local tweed industry to bring more income to the island and to help the weavers. And she, in fact, commissioned women to weave the Murray tartan and clothing for the estate workers and the gillies. And she also set up a scheme to improve the quality of the tweed and find new dyes for it. And because she was an aristocrat, she was well connected, and she could use those connections to promote the tweed and the sales, which of course were significantly increased because of her. So, that's a little known story, I suspect. And I think it's interesting that, we have women like that who lie behind a lot of things that we perhaps don't associate with women at all, but which are incredibly important to the Scottish economy and Scottish life.
Thank you. Jane, is there anyone who surprised you?
Yes, I'm just going to mention a woman whose very varied career has got some quite surprising turns. She's called Eglantine Wallis, born in 1754. And she was a dramatist, an author, an exile, and reputed to be a spy. She came from an aristocratic background, and very unusually, after divorcing her husband, which was itself unusual, she took up writing plays, and she lived a fairly scandalous life. In 1788, she entered the gallery of the House of Commons dressed as a man, and this news spread all over London. As a result, her latest play was booed out of the theatre. In 1789, when she visited revolutionary France, she was arrested as a spy. She went on to write quite politically aware works, critical of the conduct of the war between Britain and France. But on going into exile after Britain got too hot for her, she sent regular reports back on the state of the French and German armies to Whitehall. And she was again arrested as a spy by the French in 1800. She died in Munich in 1803. And I think her very unconventional life is one which we've got quite a few women who don't always observe the conventions, who don't always observe the stereotypes in any way. They challenge a great deal of what is assumed about women's lives in the past.
Thank you. That really struck me, and so many of the women in the book is that there throughout history have been assumptions about the role of women in the world, and how so many of them just tore those up, threw them out the window, and paid absolutely no attention, and went on to forge their own paths, which is wonderfully inspiring. Siân, is there any women in there that really surprised you?
Well, I picked somebody who I just found was just completely surprising. I'd never heard of her before. And she was an architect called Catherine Findlay, who was born in Scotland and who trained as an architect and then went to Japan. And her husband was Japanese, and between them they set up a practice. But what is so surprising about it, and you would need to go online and just tap in soft and hairy house. And one of her designs, it looks totally bonkers, but it's wonderful. The hairy house has grass growing on the roof. In fact, it's as it were, both very modern and going back to traditional cottages, which used to have cows grazing on the roof, so if you lived on a hill. And she was remarkable for a kind of soft architecture. I mean, we've already mentioned the Mackey Centres, which are a whole set of different architects, but there are relatively few well-known women architects. Nevertheless, in Scotland we have some, Edith Burnett, and we have one or two architects. But Catherine Findlay is kind of really, at the same time, out on a limb. It's almost like her designs come from outer space. They're bendy, they're soft, and they're futuristic. And she said she got into terrible trouble in Japan because they weren't minimalist. They're the opposite of minimalist. They kind of, they're bendy and they have funny colours in them and so on. And alas, she died relatively young, but she was in the process of still redesigning the inside of a museum in York, which we've all seen, and Jane lives in York. And you can see the redesign of the inside of a traditional building in York.
Jane, do you think there's anybody you feel is really overlooked or underrated that you've included?
Well, just to mention one individual name and one category of women whom we haven't really talked about yet. The individual name is Betty McGregor, who was a doctor and a cytologist. That is, she was working on the structure and function of cells. And it was Betty McGregor who, when working in Aberdeen in the late 60s, saw an important, really clinical need for women to be screened for cervical cancer. She initiated and maintained the first successful screening programme for cervical cancer in the UK from the mid-1960s. Although there was much debate before the NHS took it on and ran a national programme from 1980. We owe her a great deal, so there's very little recognition of her name publicly. And then the category I wanted to mention is often overlooked, and it's of women who exercise significant power through their religious lives. That is, in the medieval period, there were a number of women leaders of religious houses who are represented in our dictionary. For instance, St. Ab, who founded a double monastery of monks and nuns at St. Ab's Head near Coldingham around 640 AD. Or in later periods, there were women who led religious movements. Elspeth Buchan in 1783 founded a religious sect known as the Buchanites. Darcy Maxwell, Lady Maxwell of Pollock, was a leader of Edinburgh Methodism and a lifelong friend of John Wesley. And her close associate, Lady Glenorchy, from 1774, founded an extensive network of chapels in Edinburgh and throughout Britain, and left a large sum of money to maintain the religious life which she'd begun. And I think that in our standard histories of Scotland, such women often get overlooked, and we don't understand the kind of power and influence which they could exert. Yeah.
Thank you for that, and thank you all for sharing your experiences of all these women who, as you say, many of them were overlooked and underestimated, and yet went on to have great influence in our country and in our culture. And I know that so many readers are going to be inspired now to get themselves a copy and dig deep and hopefully find out so much more about the contribution of women in Scotland. So thank you all for sharing your enthusiasm and your knowledge. I could chat about these women with you all afternoon, but I think we should draw that to a close. So I would just like to extend my great and sincere thanks to Jane Mendel, Rose Pipes and Siân Reynolds for joining me today to discuss the new Biographical Dictionary of Scottish Women. Thank you all.
Thank you, Elaine.
Thank you.